Sometimes history hides things so enormous that we only notice them when we leave the planet. Hidden deep in the Sahara is a perfect circle 25 miles wide, a formation so strange that astronauts were the first to truly see it. Yet despite its size, its symmetry, and its eerie resemblance to a giant eye staring straight up through the sand, no one can fully explain how it formed. This is the Richat Structure, the Eye of the Sahara, and tonight we're going to gently unravel one of Earth's quietest and most hypnotic mysteries. But here's the part that stops you in your tracks. However, despite all our technology, satellite mapping, and geological theories, the Richat Structure still doesn't neatly fit into any box. It isn't a crater, it isn't a volcano, and it isn't the kind of erosion that typically produces such clean, concentric rings. And yet there it sits, alone in the desert, looking just organized enough to make your brain whisper, "Wait, who made that?" Now, don't worry. We're not here to chase sensational theories or sprint through conspiracies. This channel is all about slowing down, letting curiosity stretch out a bit, and using history's strangest corners as gentle stepping stones toward rest. So if you're someone who falls asleep best to ancient civilizations, quiet landscapes, and mysteries wrapped in soft, soothing detail, you're in the right place tonight. Go ahead and dim the lights, settle in, and if you haven't already, subscribe to continue exploring the enigmatic corners of history that make the perfect companions for sleep. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I really do love seeing the entire world checking in. Tonight's journey starts with the moment humanity first encountered the Richat Structure. Not from the shifting dunes below, but from hundreds of miles above the Earth, where astronauts stared down at the Sahara and spotted something that absolutely shouldn't have been there. From that strange cosmic discovery, we'll move slowly backward through time to the lush green Sahara that existed long before the desert we know, to the geological puzzles that still bother scientists, and eventually to the gentle whispers of an ancient legend you may already be thinking about. So take a breath, let your shoulders relax, and whenever you're ready, we'll begin with Chapter 1, the moment we first glanced down from orbit and saw the eye looking back. Chapter 1. The Eye That Shouldn't Exist. Imagine looking down at Earth from orbit, the Sahara stretched beneath you in soft, endless waves of gold. From up there, the desert doesn't look harsh or unforgiving. It looks calm, like a giant sleeping creature under a pale blue sky. Astronauts have always taken moments to stare at the planet that way, partly out of awe, partly out of boredom, and partly because when you're strapped into a metal capsule moving faster than anything humans were ever meant to travel in, looking out the window is one of the few activities that doesn't involve switches, checklists, or mild existential dread. But during one of those early missions in the 1960s, a crew noticed something unusual, a shape far too large, too perfect, and too strange to ignore. Down on the desert floor, there was a circle, a perfect circle, 25 miles across, spiraling outward in broad rings that looked almost architectural. Not a crater, not a mountain, not a lake, just a massive, quiet symbol pressed into the land, so large that the only way to truly see it was to leave the planet entirely. To those astronauts, it looked like an eye staring straight back at them from the surface of Mauritania, the Richat Structure, though it didn't have that name yet. At the time, it was simply that giant thing nobody expected. From a distance of hundreds of miles, the symmetry was unmistakable, perfect curves, clean rings, a massive pupil-shaped center. It had the kind of geometry that makes your brain immediately start asking questions it can't answer. Why is it so round? Who carved it? What force makes a shape like this in a place so empty? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how could something this big go unnoticed for so long? On the ground, the Richat structure is much less obvious. If you were walking across it on foot, you wouldn't see a circle at all. You'd just see gentle ridges rising and falling, interrupted by patches of rock, sand, and stubborn little plants that somehow decided this environment was worth the trouble. Nothing about it screams perfect cosmic spiral. From eye level, it looks like any other collection of rocky hills, the kind of place early travelers might have grumbled about after stubbing a toe or losing a sandal in a patch of loose sand. People likely passed through it for thousands of years without realizing they were walking across something extraordinary. And that contrast, invisible from below, unavoidable from above, is part of what makes the Richat structure so hypnotic. It's a feature you can only understand by stepping back far enough to see the pattern. It quietly resists being known, as if it only reveals itself to observers who approach from the right angle, with the right distance, and the right amount of patience. Scientists naturally tried to classify it the moment the images came down from orbit. Their job, after all, is to put everything neatly into categories, like very polite librarians of the natural world. But the Richat structure didn't fit easily. Some insisted it must be an impact crater until the evidence disagreed. No signs of shocked quartz, no melted rock, none of the scars left by a cosmic collision. Others suspected a volcano, but there was no volcanic rock. No lava flows, no ash deposits. Then came theories of uplift, erosion, domes, collapses, each one working nicely for the first few sentences before quietly falling apart upon closer inspection. The Richat structure, in classic mysterious fashion, remained cooperative enough to study, but stubborn enough to defy a simple explanation. It sits awkwardly between categories, like a puzzle piece cut in the wrong shape but still clearly belonging to the overall picture. And it doesn't help that it's located in one of the most remote regions of the Sahara, far from major trade routes, major kingdoms, or the kinds of resources that attract large ancient settlements. This is not the place where ancient people built empires or dug canals or left behind giant inscriptions announcing their presence. It's a place of wind, silence, heat, and sand, the kind of environment that erases evidence as quickly as humans can create it. Yet even in that isolation, the Richat structure demands attention. It is too large to ignore, too precise to dismiss, and too quiet to fully understand. You look at it, and it feels like a riddle you weren't meant to solve on the first attempt. The desert around it stretches endlessly, dunes rising and falling like slow-motion waves, while the structure itself sits calmly in the center, a spiral carved into a world of shifting sand. There is a strange comfort in its stillness, as if it has been watching changes for far longer than humans have been paying attention, waiting patiently for someone to finally look down and notice. People naturally draw comparisons to ancient tales, especially the ones involving circular cities and lost civilizations swallowed by disaster. Humans are not subtle when it comes to pattern recognition. You show us a shape that even vaguely resembles something familiar, and our imaginations sprint ahead with enthusiasm. A structure with concentric rings in northwest Africa, larger than many ancient cities. The connections write themselves, but resisting those assumptions for now helps us appreciate just how odd the Richat structure is on its own terms. We don't need myths yet. The geology alone is strange enough to occupy the mind, and perhaps the most compelling detail is this. The Richat structure did not emerge in the desert we see today. It predates the dunes, the dryness, the isolation. It formed long before this region became a barren expanse, back when the land was green, watery, and alive. Understanding what this place used to look like changes everything about how we interpret the structure, because the environment around it wasn't always harsh silence. There was a time when this region held rivers, lakes, animals, and early humans whose daily lives unfolded under a sky that seems impossible when compared to the Sahara's modern emptiness. The Richat Structure watched all of that. It watched ecosystems rise and fall, climates swing from wet to dry and back again, people migrate across its slopes, and entire landscapes vanish beneath shifting dunes. Before we compare it to any myth, we have to travel back to that older world, the Sahara before the Sahara, to see what the eye looked like when it was surrounded not by sand, but by life. To understand why the Richat Structure feels so uncanny, you have to set aside the modern Sahara entirely. The desert we picture today, an endless, shimmering expanse of heat and sand, is actually one of the youngest landscapes on the planet. For most of human existence, this region wasn't a wasteland at all. It was green, fertile, and astonishingly alive. Picture wide grasslands rolling out to the horizon, with clusters of acacia trees and patches of wetlands where birds gathered in noisy flocks. Picture rivers meandering through valleys, carrying cool water across a landscape thick with the smell of damp soil after summer rains. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the Richat Structure sat quietly, not as an isolated monument in an empty desert, but as part of a thriving environment full of sounds, movement, and human life. This ancient green Sahara wasn't a brief, lucky moment in history. It was part of a repeating cycle caused by subtle shifts in Earth's orbit and tilt, changes that alter the intensity of monsoon rains across Africa. Every so often, rainfall increases enough to transform the desert into a lush savanna. During these humid periods, lakes stretch across thousands of square miles, rivers intersect the plains, and the entire landscape becomes something you'd associate more with national parks than the modern Sahara. One of these lakes, Lake Megachad, grew so large it dwarfed most modern bodies of water. Today it's reduced to a fraction of its former size, but the ancient shoreline is still visible from space, ghostly arcs etched into the ground. People lived in this green Sahara, not mythical super beings or forgotten high-tech civilizations, just ordinary families doing the same things humans have always done, carrying water, tending fires, raising children, arguing about small chores, making tools because stores wouldn't exist for another 10,000 years. They carved rock art showing giraffes, cattle, and hunters. They painted scenes of life that would feel familiar even now. Herders guiding animals, groups traveling together, children playing near pools of water. These paintings sit today in silent caves and overhangs, reminders that the desert once held a different world entirely. In that greener age, the Richat Structure would have been part of daily life, not an object of wonder, not a sacred shape, not a giant spiral people tried to decode. Just land from the ground. The structure doesn't appear circular. You only see ridges and slopes, gentle arcs rising and falling like the ribs of a giant slowly sleeping beneath the surface. Early humans would have walked across it without a second thought. Maybe they used its higher points as lookout spots to scan for animals. Maybe they sheltered in its inner valleys when storms rolled through. Maybe they avoided certain parts out of superstition, or maybe they never thought about it at all. Most likely it was simply background scenery, the same way we barely notice the hills near our own towns unless someone points out their shape. But even if it blended into the landscape, the Richat structure would have quietly shaped the rhythm of life around it. The ridges could have guided migration paths. Water might have pooled in certain low areas after seasonal rains. Vegetation could have grown thicker in pockets where moisture collected. For thousands of years, people and animals would have used the structure without realizing they were interacting with something that would one day puzzle scientists, entice researchers, and inspire late-night conversations about lost civilizations and ancient catastrophes. As the climate shifted and rainfall declined, the green Sahara slowly began to fade. Lakes shrank, rivers dried, vegetation withered. The smell of earth after rain became less common. Migration stretched longer as people followed dwindling water sources, and eventually dunes crept across the landscape, swallowing paths, burying campsites, and erasing nearly all traces of the world that had existed before. What's haunting about this transformation is how quickly it happened in geological terms. A few thousand years, an eye blink in Earth's timeline, was all it took to turn a thriving ecosystem into one of the largest deserts on the planet. The people who lived here would have witnessed that shift firsthand. Generation by generation, they watched lakes retreat, animals disperse, and once reliable seasonal patterns collapse. Oral traditions from various African cultures still contain echoes of climates changing, waters disappearing, or ancestral migrations driven by environmental upheaval. Stories stretch and distort across centuries, of course, but they often carry a spark of truth at their core. And it's not unreasonable to imagine that somewhere in the long, layered history of this region, memories of a circular landform in a once wet landscape might have eventually become a distant, reshaped legend. When modern researchers study the Sahara's ancient lakes and rivers, they often describe them as ghost waterways, because their traces linger beneath the dunes like faint scars, visible only from satellite images or through careful ground surveys. It's peaceful in a strange way to picture these lost rivers running across land that now feels so desolate. The desert is quiet, but beneath that quiet are the outlines of ecosystems that once flourished. The Richat structure existed during all of those cycles. It watched water fill basins, watched wetlands grow thick with life, watched grass return and then die away. It endured storms, sun, wind, and the slow grinding force of erosion. There's something soothing about how unbothered the structure is by all these changes. Landscapes rise and fall, climates swing wildly, civilizations appear and vanish, and the Richat structure simply remains. It doesn't tell its own story. It doesn't announce its presence. It doesn't offer answers. It's just there, a constant in a world where almost nothing else is. And understanding that ancient environment is essential because it sets the stage for the real puzzle, how this enormous circular formation came to be in the first place. The scientific explanations, volcanic uplift, erosion, collapsed domes, answer some questions while raising others. Each theory seems convincing until you begin to examine the details. The Richat structure looks simple from orbit, but grows more complicated the closer you approach it, like a calm surface hiding a tangled set of mysteries beneath. Now that the Sahara's old green world is clear in your mind, the geological puzzle becomes even more intriguing, because any explanation has to account not only for the structure's shape, but for how incredibly long it has stood unchanged through shifting climates and changing environments. The puzzle sits before us, layer after stubborn layer. Once you've pictured the Sahara as it used to be, wet, green, alive, and almost unrecognizable, the Richat structure becomes even stranger because whatever formed this enormous circle had to withstand everything nature threw at it: floods, droughts, storms, shifting climates, and entire ecosystems rising and collapsing. And yet it remains, not as a faint trace or a distorted outline, but as a nearly perfect set of rings still visible from space. That kind of durability demands an explanation, and scientists have certainly tried to provide one. The trouble is, each explanation works well for a few minutes before quietly unraveling under closer inspection, as if the Earth itself had decided to play a slow geologic prank on everyone who studies it. The first idea scientists proposed was the most obvious: an impact crater. Something big, something dramatic, something that would have made an enormous noise if anyone had been around to hear it. A meteorite slamming into the ground would create a circular depression, after all. And the Sahara is certainly large enough to have attracted its fair share of flying space debris. But the Richat structure doesn't behave like a crater. Craters have distinct signatures, very specific patterns of shock, melted rock, and high-pressure minerals that act like the universe's version of a calling card. And the Richat has none of those. In fact, the rocks at its center aren't melted or crushed at all. They're simply there. Old, eroded, stubbornly normal. Not the sort of rocks you'd expect to find at the scene of a cosmic collision. So the meteor theory quietly excused itself from the conversation, and the next geological explanation stepped forward: a volcanic eruption. Volcanoes can create circular features after all, and their plumbing beneath the earth can sometimes produce domes, bulges, and ringed formations. Perhaps the Richat structure was an ancient volcanic dome, the remains of a magma chamber swelling beneath the surface before cooling and collapsing. But again, the evidence refuses to cooperate. There's no volcanic rock, no basalt flows, no ash layers, no hardened lava tubes, nothing that says, yes, once upon a time fire erupted here. The region around the Richat structure is geologically calm. Too calm for the kind of drama that volcanoes tend to bring into the world. The next traditional candidate was an eroded dome, something called a geological uplift. Imagine a bubble pushing up from beneath the crust, slow enough to avoid attracting attention, then eroding away for millions of years until a circular pattern of rocks remains. This idea actually gets halfway close, because the Richat does contain different layers of rock exposed in circular patterns, almost like the inside of a peeled onion. But even this explanation feels incomplete. Uplifts don't usually produce such clean rings. Erosion is messy. Wind and water rarely work with architectural precision, and yet the Richat structure has rings so consistent that they appear intentional when viewed from above. The dome theory explains the general shape, but not the perfection of it, and certainly not its scale. A 25-mile wide circle is not something easily dismissed as coincidence. Even erosion has its limits when it comes to symmetry, and geologists who typically love tidy classifications had to admit the Richat structure was mostly behaving but not entirely cooperating, like a student turning in homework that looks suspiciously too neat compared to their handwriting in class. Then there's the age problem. The rocks that make up the Richat structure are incredibly old, hundreds of millions of years in some places, but the shaping of the structure itself, the exposure of its rings, is much younger, something pushed upward long ago, something eroded later, something left behind a pattern that would eventually catch the eye of anyone staring down from orbit. It's not a single event. It's a series of long, slow, overlapping processes, each stretching far beyond the human timeline. And yet even knowing that, the structure feels too deliberate. The more scientists studied it, the more the Richat structure revealed small curiosities. The center is oddly flattened. Some ring segments are more pronounced than others. The patterns of quartzite and softer stone alternate in ways that feel as though nature was following a set of instructions. But nature doesn't usually draw in spirals or circles unless something dramatic is happening. Impact, volcanism, collapse. But in this case, the evidence for anything dramatic is conspicuously absent. And then there's the perfect ring issue, the one that quietly bothers everyone who looks at the structure, even if they don't say it out loud. Circles in nature are rare at this scale. Random erosion doesn't create them, rivers don't carve them, wind doesn't sculpt them, and when you see one this large, this clean, and this old, it's hard not to feel like the earth briefly decided to act like a compass and draw a near-perfect shape in the sand. It's not surprising that the Richat structure often leaves people with a vague sense of unease, not fear, not dread, just the gentle discomfort of encountering something that feels too orderly in a world built on chaos. Geologically, the best explanation we currently have is that the Richat structure started as a circular uplift, a dome of ancient rock that rose slowly from the earth long before humans existed. Over tens of millions of years, wind and water eroded the softer materials, leaving behind harder rings of quartzite that resisted erosion. In essence, the shape is a natural accident, a byproduct of uplift plus erosion plus time. But even if this is the correct explanation, it still doesn't quite satisfy the imagination, because most uplifts don't look like this. Most erosion doesn't cooperate so neatly. And so the Richat structure lives in that strange middle space, scientifically explainable, yet visually suspicious, like a naturally occurring optical illusion, a formation that checks enough geological boxes to avoid being classified as supernatural, yet raises enough questions to spark curiosity in anyone who looks at it. It's the kind of feature that almost begs for a story or a legend, something to give meaning to its shape, even if that meaning exists only in the human mind. Once you've explored the geological explanations and realized none of them fully capture the structure's quiet strangeness, it becomes easier to understand why some people entertain a very different question. Not the scientific, what made this, but the mythic, does this remind me of something? A city described long ago with concentric rings of land and water, positioned somewhere to the west of ancient civilizations, a place said to have vanished in a single day and night. The Richat structure does not announce itself as that place, but it echoes the pattern just enough to make you wonder where coincidence ends and imagination begins. Before any comparisons can be made gently or cautiously, the building blocks of those ancient descriptions must be understood, not as fantasy, but as the fragments of memory, geography, and storytelling that shaped one of history's most enduring legends. Long before anyone could stare down at satellite images or argue over geological uplift on the internet, there was a different kind of puzzle circulating through the ancient world. A story recorded by a single philosopher, passed on from a conversation he claimed to have heard, describing a civilization so strange and so perfectly structured that it bordered on myth even in its own time. Plato's tale of Atlantis has been repeated so often, repackaged so many times, and stretched so far by imagination that the original description often gets lost under the weight of all the versions built on top of it. But if you strip away the embellishments, the crystal cities, the impossible technologies, the ancient aliens with clipboards, interpretations, you're left with a surprisingly simple outline: a circular city, rings of land and water, mountains to the north protecting it, a broad plain to the south, a river that flowed to the sea stones of red, black, and white, abundant animals, especially elephants, and a civilization that rose to prominence before collapsing in a sudden, dramatic event. Whether this description is literal, symbolic, exaggerated, or entirely fictional is something scholars have debated for centuries. But what matters for our quiet journey tonight is not whether Atlantis existed. What matters is the shape of the story, because that shape is what causes people to glance at a satellite photo of the Richat structure and pause. The comparison doesn't begin with belief. It begins with pattern recognition. Humans are wired to look for familiar shapes in unfamiliar places. It's the same instinct that makes us see faces in electrical outlets or animals in passing clouds. So when someone sees a massive set of concentric rings in northwest Africa, a structure wrapped in mystery and sitting in a region that once held rivers, lakes, and life, it's reasonable that part of their brain whispers, "This looks like something I've heard before." The resemblance is not perfect, not literal, not conclusive, but it's enough to make curiosity shift in its seat a little. Consider the colors Plato mentions: red, black, and white stones. The Richat structure, like much of the Sahara, contains layers of rock and sediment that naturally fall into those shades. Iron-rich sandstone brings the red. Basalt and volcanic remnants elsewhere in the region bring the black, and pale limestones offer the white. No one is saying ancient builders selected them and arranged them like a geological art project, but the coincidence is interesting, especially when paired with the natural ring pattern visible from above. Then there are the mountains. Plato describes a notable mountain range to the north of Atlantis. The Richat structure sits in front of the Adrar Plateau, a raised, rugged region that would have looked like a natural wall in a greener era. Today, it's a dry, worn highland, sculpted by time and wind, but long ago it would have been more dramatic. Cliffs, ridges, and elevated land dotted with vegetation and wildlife. If early people lived in the region, they would have viewed those northern heights as a defining feature of their landscape. And what about animals? This part always surprises people because they imagine the Sahara as permanently empty. But during the African humid period, elephants were plentiful. So were giraffes, rhinos, crocodiles, and countless other species. Elephants weren't just passing through, they were thriving. Some rock art across the Sahara shows entire herds, depicted with the casual familiarity of people who lived alongside them. So yes, if someone had described this region during one of its greener eras, full of elephants, would have been an accurate statement. The river connection is where things become both interesting and gentle in their ambiguity. In a lush Sahara, a river system could have flowed westward toward the Atlantic. Some ancient channels still appear faintly beneath the modern desert, traced by satellite radar and geological surveys. These channels hint that at least some rivers once traveled across areas that are now sand and stone. Whether any of them connected near the Richat structure is debated, but the possibility is not unreasonable. In a world where climates shifted dramatically, waterways did too. It's worth saying calmly and clearly, none of these correlations prove anything. They simply show why the mind wanders toward the comparison. The Richat structure does not need Atlantis to be interesting. Its mystery stands fully on its own. But when the circular shape, the colors, the mountains, the animals, and the long-lost rivers all quietly line up with parts of an old story, your thoughts naturally drift toward the what-if of it all. Plato wasn't writing a travel guide. He was a philosopher using allegory to make a point about human nature. power, hubris, and collapse, Atlantis, in his narrative, was less a factual account and more a moral lesson bundled into a geographic metaphor. Yet even then, scholars have noted that ancient myths often embed distorted memories of older events, storms, floods, migrations, or lost settlements folded into stories, generation after generation. Myths protect what history doesn't always preserve. They store impressions of landscapes that no longer exist. They embellish, exaggerate, simplify, and dramatize, but something recognizable occasionally survives inside them. The Richat structure doesn't have ruins. It doesn't have walls, canals, columns, marketplaces, or any of the features you'd expect of a large city. The environment around it would have been challenging even in greener times. And human settlements from that ancient period would likely have left fragile traces now erased by thousands of years of wind and shifting sand. So the idea of it being a lost civilization rests not on evidence but on the shape alone, the irresistible symmetry that triggers recognition even when no proof supports it. That's part of the comfort of this mystery. It doesn't demand belief. It simply invites curiosity. You don't have to imagine ancient kings or advanced societies. You don't have to build a hidden metropolis in your mind. All you need to do is stand quietly before a satellite image and let the shape speak for itself. A giant ringed formation in the middle of an ancient landscape that has changed almost beyond understanding. Somewhere between geology, memory, climate, erosion, and myth sits the Richat structure. It tells us nothing directly. It refuses to commit to any single story, and perhaps that's why it remains such a calming mystery, one that doesn't need dramatic conclusions or bold claims. It only needs an open horizon, a quiet night, and the imagination drifting gently toward possibilities. Chapter 2 begins with the world that once surrounded this structure, a world of forgotten lakes, shifting climates, and early peoples who lived in a Sahara that doesn't resemble the one we know today. Chapter 2: A Lost World Buried in Sand. To step into the next layer of the Richat mystery, you have to imagine a Sahara that feels almost impossible compared to the one we know today. Not the hot, shimmering, bone-dry desert that stretches endlessly across maps, but a world so green and alive that if you were dropped into it without context, you might not even guess you were standing in northern Africa at all. The Sahara's greener eras weren't brief accidents of climate. They were entire chapters of Earth's history, long enough for lakes to swell into inland seas, for animals to migrate freely across savannas, and for human communities to settle into rhythms of daily life as familiar and as ordinary as any other early society. In that forgotten landscape, the Richat structure wasn't an isolated swirl of geology in a barren desert. It was simply part of the scenery, a ringed plateau sitting quietly in a world full of life. During the African humid period, monsoon rains shifted northward and transformed the Sahara into a mosaic of grasslands, wetlands, and rivers. Satellite studies have revealed thousands of ancient lake beds, some stretching larger than modern countries. The largest of them, Lake Megachad, was so vast that its shoreline would have swallowed entire modern coastlines. It's calming to picture early mornings on its edges, mist lifting off the water, birds scattering across reeds, herds moving slowly through tall grass. These weren't isolated oases like today, but interconnected ecosystems humming with life. Hippos wallowed in shallow pools, giraffes wandered across plains, crocodiles glided through freshwater channels, The air was thick with insects in the rainy season and warm, earthy scents after storms passed. And where there is water and game, people settle. Early human groups built small camps near river bends, moving seasonally with herds or weather patterns. Their lives weren't glamorous. They dealt with all the usual prehistoric frustrations: unpredictable weather, stubborn animals, unreliable food sources, and the constant inconvenience of tools that, despite countless hours of crafting, were still capable of breaking at the worst possible moment. Yet these people left behind some of the most beautiful artifacts the Sahara still holds: rock engravings and paintings showing scenes of daily life, hunters with bows, families with cattle, children playing near water. These artworks are serene, calm snapshots of a world that no longer exists, carved into stone that has stubbornly endured long after the lakes dried. When people imagine ancient civilizations, they picture dramatic stone cities, elaborate temples, complex political systems, the kinds of things that leave behind headlines in history books. But most ancient people, including those who lived in the Green Sahara, were just trying to get through the week without too much trouble. They managed herds, gathered plants, navigated seasonal routes, and dealt with occasional arguments about who forgot to maintain the fire or who accidentally let a goat wander off into the brush. Civilization doesn't have to look like marble pillars to be worth remembering. Sometimes it's found in the small, repetitive rhythms of daily life, the quiet rituals that define communities. And those communities were not isolated dots scattered randomly across a wet desert. They followed predictable paths. Rivers acted like highways, lakes acted like hubs. Fertile pockets of land created gathering points where groups traded, shared food, and passed down stories. Even without permanent stone buildings, these places had identities, regions where people knew how to track animals, where certain plants grew well, where rainfall was reliable, where the land felt generous enough for families to stay a little longer. In this setting, the Richat Structure would have been noticeable, but not mysterious. Its slopes rose gently, offering views of surrounding plains. Its depressions may have caught water seasonally. Its ringed layers might have supported different kinds of vegetation depending on rain and soil. People could have camped along its edges, used its higher ground for scouting, or traveled across it without realizing they were walking across an enormous circular formation that future generations would discover only from space. It was a feature of the land, not a legend, a place you pass through while thinking about practical concerns, shelter, food, weather, instead of trying to decode the terrain beneath your feet. Some researchers have suggested that pockets of early Saharan cultures may have grown surprisingly sophisticated during particularly wet periods, not in the sense of monumental architecture or complex written languages, but in social networks, trade patterns, and livestock management. Evidence shows early domestication of cattle in the region, and groups may have practiced proto-agricultural techniques around wetlands and lake margins. These weren't lost empires. They were adaptable, resilient societies navigating a landscape that could shift dramatically over generations. The idea that a civilization could thrive here, disappear, and leave little trace isn't far-fetched at all. Wet climates draw people, harsh climates erase them. The desert isn't just unforgiving, it's efficient. Wind strips away organic material, sand buries structures, drought erases evidence of farming, floods wash away tools, and time paired with enough silence can erase almost anything that isn't carved into stone. The Sahara has a way of taking the past, smoothing it out, and leaving behind a surface that pretends nothing was ever there. Even so, Pieces of that older world survive: fossilized bones, pollen samples trapped beneath sand, ancient shorelines stamped faintly into the earth, and rock art that still shows people standing beside animals that haven't lived in this region for thousands of years. These fragments don't tell a complete story, but they do confirm one thing: the Sahara was once a place where human life thrived, not merely survived. And in that world, the Richat Structure might have been a landmark of sorts, a subtle gate in the landscape, a recognizable formation people used to orient themselves, not a secret, not a holy site, and not the center of anything monumental, just a distinctive feature in a land full of water and vegetation. The idea that early groups might have navigated by it is peaceful to imagine. Small bands of families moving across plains, spotting the familiar rise of the rings in the distance, and knowing they were approaching water or shade or simply a place they'd passed through many times before. When the climate shifted and the world dried, those routes disappeared. Lakes shrank into nothing. Rivers retreated and carved new paths underground. Families moved south or west, following food and water. Eventually, the Richat Structure went from living landmark to abandoned plateau, then to forgotten geology swallowed by the earliest dunes. There are no written records, no monuments, no grand architectural remains from this era, just silence and the faint memory of a world washed away by time. The civilizations of the Green Sahara weren't lost in a dramatic catastrophe. They faded gradually, quietly, as the rains weakened and the land transformed, and that gradual fading matters when we begin comparing ancient descriptions, lost worlds in the shape of stories that survived long after the land itself changed beyond recognition. The timeline of that fading, and how closely it lines up with certain ancient myths, forms the next layer in the riddle. When people hear the word Atlantis, they often imagine something impossibly ancient, a civilization so old it might as well have existed when mammoths were still wandering around, being large, shaggy inconveniences. But Plato didn't describe Atlantis as a civilization from the dawn of time. He dated its downfall to around 9,600 BCE, a period surprisingly close to the end of the last ice age and, as it happens, surprisingly close to the moment when the Sahara began shifting into one of its long, humid phases. The more you compare his proposed timeline with the environmental data, the more you notice an odd overlap, not in details or certainty, but in rhythm. And rhythm is often what ancient memories preserve best. Geologists studying the African humid period estimate that around 10,000 BCE, rainfall began increasing dramatically across North Africa. The desert, which had been relatively dry and barren, transformed into a landscape of lakes, wetlands, and grasslands. This wasn't a gentle shift. Climate models show that the monsoon system surged northward in a way that would have felt abrupt on a human timescale. Rivers reappeared, plants spread, herds expanded, and places that had been empty for thousands of years suddenly became habitable again. If you were living anywhere near the region, the shift would have felt like the land itself waking up after a long sleep. Plato's date for Atlantis is often treated like a mystical number. But if you strip away the mythology and look only at the time frame, it places his story right inside the most dramatic environmental transformation the Sahara has ever undergone. That doesn't mean his tale describes this region or any part of it, but the coincidence is interesting, especially because climate change on that scale tends to rearrange human populations. Cultures migrate. Old settlements are abandoned, new territories open for exploration. Oral traditions begin to evolve, preserving memories of places that were flooded or dried out or swallowed by landscapes that changed too quickly for people to adapt smoothly. The timeline problem becomes more intriguing when you move forward a few thousand years. Between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 BCE, the Sahara was at the peak of its green transformation. Lakes were plentiful. Rivers connected regions that are now separated by hundreds of miles of sand. The climate was stable enough that people began developing more complex subsistence strategies, managing herds, experimenting with early forms of cultivation, and forming social groups large enough to leave meaningful traces in rock art and archaeological deposits. This period of stability lasted longer than many ancient civilizations. For thousands of years, life in the Sahara was predictable enough for generations to grow up without ever knowing anything except abundant water, warm seasons, and a landscape that supported human life easily. When conditions are that reliable for that long, people tend to form stories about belonging, about identity, about who they are and how their world works. And when environmental changes finally disrupt those patterns, the departure from what once felt normal can echo through oral traditions for centuries. Around 5000 BCE, rainfall began to decline, slowly at first, then more dramatically. Rivers shrank, lakes retreated, grasslands thinned. People who had lived in certain places for generations found themselves forced to move, one small migration at a time. What's striking about this timeline is how well it fits what many ancient myths tend to describe. Not sudden apocalypses, but drawn-out declines, landscapes that once supported life losing their balance. Cultures forced to let go of familiar places, worlds shrinking gradually in ways that felt both natural and tragic. Plato described Atlantis as falling in a moment of sudden catastrophe, but his narrative was shaped by philosophical goals, not meteorological accuracy. When you strip the moral and symbolic layers away, you're left with a simple suggestion: an old civilization, once vibrant, lost to changing conditions long before recorded history. You don't need a supernatural event to produce a memory like that. All you need is a shifting climate. But the timeline problem isn't just about the humid period itself. It's also about the ancient coastline. During the era Plato places Atlantis, sea levels were dramatically lower. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern boundaries. Large parts of West Africa that are now underwater would have been exposed as dry land. Rivers would have flowed along different paths. Estuaries, marshes, and coastal plains would have existed where the ocean now rests. If someone in the deep past described a coastal landscape, that description would make little sense today unless you knew where the shoreline used to be. This matters because many interpretations of Plato's story assume that his geography reflects the world we see now, when in reality, none of the modern coastlines apply. What he described could have been based on something that existed thousands of years before the Sahara dried, in a world with rivers and lakes stretching across land that is now considered lifeless. The Richat Structure itself sits inland today, but in an earlier era, with different river networks and different coastlines, it might not have felt nearly as isolated. Human perception of geography is always shaped by local experience. A river can feel like a highway. A lake can feel like a boundary. A plateau can feel like a landmark that divides territories. When climates shift, those familiar markers vanish, but the stories about them can persist long after the landscape has changed beyond recognition. The most compelling part of this timeline overlap isn't the idea that Atlantis maps onto the Sahara. It's the realization that human memory, especially oral tradition, often stretches back further than we assume. Cultures pass down stories of floods, droughts, migrations, and disappearing lands without needing exact dates or written scripts. These stories evolve, take on symbolic meaning, and sometimes become cautionary tales. but the seeds of truth often remain embedded in the narrative. A changing coastline becomes a city swallowed by the sea. A drying river becomes the fall of a once great kingdom. A shifting climate becomes a punishment from the gods. Human imagination attaches meaning to change, especially when change feels larger than individual experience. The Richat Structure sits quietly in the middle of this enormous timeline, a geological constant in a world that refused to stay still. Ancient people may have lived near it when the land was green. Their descendants may have moved away when the desert expanded. Their grandchildren may have carried memories of lost lakes or vanished rivers into stories told over fires in distant regions. Those stories may have drifted into different cultures over thousands of years, and by the time someone like Plato heard fragments of them, much of the original context would have faded, leaving only symbols and shapes. The timeline problem is not really a problem at all. It's a reminder. The Sahara we know today is young. The world Plato described was older than most of the settlements humans would later build. And between those eras, countless stories were lost, reshaped, or retold. When you compare timelines, climates, and ancient memories, the idea of a forgotten world in North Africa stops sounding fantastical and begins to sound, quietly, like something entirely plausible in a landscape that has reinvented itself so many times. The next piece of the puzzle lies in the maps, reports, and strange hints left by ancient writers who claimed that distant peoples lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in lands most Greeks had never seen. These records aren't proof, but they are clues, echoes of a world few modern people realize ever existed. Long before satellites, long before compasses, and long before anyone tried to draw the Sahara from anything resembling first-hand experience, ancient geographers took their best guesses about the world beyond familiar coastlines. Their maps were charmingly confident and wildly inaccurate, full of creatures that never existed, coastlines that wandered like drunk serpents, and entire regions labeled with vague phrases like lands unknown or people of strange appearance. Yet even within that imaginative chaos, certain patterns appear again and again. Rumors of distant nations beyond the Pillars of Hercules, stories of tall tribes, strange settlements, and river systems far to the west that no Greek or Egyptian explorer had ever reached. These fragments don't offer facts. They offer echoes, traces of a world remembered through second-hand conversations, traveling merchants, and stories that had already aged long before they were written down. Herodotus, often called the father of history and sometimes less generously the father of wildly entertaining exaggerations, wrote about mysterious peoples living beyond the familiar reaches of North Africa. He described tribes who were unusually tall, unusually pale, or unusually skilled at activities no one else could verify. He wrote of great rivers flowing through lands no Greek had ever visited, and of cities existing somewhere far inland beyond deserts that seemed too vast for ordinary travel. His accounts mix truth, rumor, and a healthy dose of "someone told me this, so here you go." But they reveal something important. The regions west of Egypt and Carthage were known to ancient writers only through layers of retelling and misunderstanding. They existed in the Greek imagination as distant, half-seen places where strange things could plausibly happen. Cartographers, centuries later, drew maps that included a massive region labeled as Libya or Ethiopia, words that covered almost everything south and west of the Mediterranean. Even when the rest of the world began to take shape on parchment, the Sahara remained a blank expanse into which map makers poured their guesses. Some thought it held great inland seas. Others believed it was home to tribal confederations wealthy in minerals. Medieval maps continued the tradition, referring to kingdoms of the West or lands of gold believed to lie somewhere beyond the desert. These weren't precise descriptions. They were memories filtered through trade routes, travelers' claims, and stories that drifted through cultures like windblown sand. The most interesting thing about these early references is not their accuracy, but their persistence. For thousands of years, people believed that lost polities existed somewhere in the interior of Africa. Some of these rumors later turned out to be distorted accounts of real kingdoms. The Ghana Empire, for example, or the early Sahelian states whose wealth came from gold and trade. But some rumors seem older, as if they preserve vague memories of societies that were already gone by the time written history began. It's not hard to imagine how this could happen if the Sahara once held lakes, rivers, and stable populations. Then early travelers from coastal regions might have heard stories about people inland who lived near great bodies of water. By the time those stories reached Greek scholars, the lakes might have dried, the migrations might have begun, and the cultures connected to those earlier landscapes might have dispersed. All that remained were fragments, not histories, just hints. Modern science adds another layer to this puzzle. With satellite imagery, researchers can trace ancient riverbeds beneath the desert. These paleo-channels, as they're called, snake across the Sahara like veins in an old, forgotten body. Some run directly from central North Africa toward what is now the Atlantic. Others branch into networks that once fed massive lakes. These rivers didn't disappear in a sudden catastrophe. They dried gradually as the climate changed, leaving landscapes that no longer match the stories that may have been told about them. If early civilizations or large communities existed near these rivers, their memory would have been separated from their physical location by thousands of years, making it nearly impossible for later cultures to understand what the stories referred to. This disconnect between old memories and new landscapes is how myths form. A story that once described a river civilization becomes, after generations of retelling, a story about a kingdom swallowed by the sea. A recollection of great plains becomes a memory of a vanished island. A description of a circular plateau becomes an account of a circular city. The Sahara's transformation from green to desert wasn't instantaneous, but it was dramatic enough to fracture cultural continuity. If families were forced to migrate because their water sources vanished, they would carry memories of their old homeland with them. Their descendants might repeat those memories in new places. By the time those descendant stories reached literate societies, the land they described would have changed beyond recognition. Even the idea of lost maps plays into this. Some early maps portray strange circular features in North Africa, drawn not with precision, but with a kind of symbolic confidence, as if the mapmaker was trying to capture something half understood. These circles often correspond to mountain ranges or basins that once held water. They might represent ancient memories of circular lakes, natural rings of highland terrain, or simply the human impulse to draw the unknown in symmetrical shapes because symmetry feels meaningful. When you compare those old maps to modern satellite images, you occasionally find that their circles line up suspiciously well with real geological features, not perfectly, but enough to make you wonder how much geographic memory survives inside even the roughest ancient drawings. And then there's the broader Mediterranean tradition of referring to lands beyond the West as mysterious, advanced, or somehow older than the civilizations closer to the sea. Phoenician traders, known for their long-range voyages, undoubtedly reached parts of West Africa, but their records are mostly lost. Carthaginian sailors may have traveled even farther, leaving behind legends like those of Hanno the Navigator, who described coastlines that are still debated today. These accounts weren't detailed maps or precise reports. They were impressions, glimpses of coasts, glimpses of rivers, glimpses of interior lands that would later be swallowed by dunes over generations. These impressions morphed. Cultures forgot the context but kept the intrigue. What makes all of this so calming and strangely satisfying is the realization that humans have always tried to map the unknown. Even when they lacked the tools, even when they guessed incorrectly, they kept trying. And in doing so, they sometimes preserved things they couldn't possibly understand. Old coastlines, vanished rivers, or stories from travelers who described worlds that no longer existed. When you approach the Sahara with that perspective, its ancient geography becomes less like a blank desert and more like a palimpsest, a surface written over many times but still carrying traces of the words beneath. The question isn't whether ancient maps show Atlantis or any other legendary city. The question is whether the stories behind those maps contain fragments of real places erased by climate and time. In a world where the Sahara once supported thriving cultures and vast waterways, it's not unreasonable to imagine that memories of those lost communities could drift across centuries, eventually arriving in distorted form on the pages of ancient writers. The final piece of this chapter lies in the moment when all those rivers dried and the green Sahara collapsed into the desert we know now. A transformation so dramatic that it could easily have become the seed of legends about worlds swallowed, lands lost, and civilizations fading into silence. When people imagine worlds disappearing, they usually picture sudden disasters, walls of water, earthquakes splitting the earth, angry gods sweeping civilizations into the sea. But the Sahara didn't collapse in a single night. Its transformation from a green, living landscape into a vast desert was quieter, slower, and far more unsettling. It wasn't a dramatic catastrophe, it was a gradual unraveling of an entire ecosystem. A process so steady and so relentless that it might have felt to the people living through it like the land itself was breathing out for the last time. This slow-motion disaster is one of the most profound environmental changes in human history, and its echoes still shape our perception of ancient worlds. The end of the African humid period began subtly. Rains that had once arrived predictably started coming later. Lakes that had always been full began to shrink just slightly around their edges. Wetlands that had supported birds, fish, and early settlements became patchier. People may not have noticed these first signs at all. One dry season feels like an anomaly. 2 in a row feel like an inconvenience. 3 or 4 begin to feel like a pattern. And before long, families who had lived near the same lake for generations might have found themselves walking farther and farther to reach the shore each year. As rainfall continued to decline, the lakes shrank dramatically. Rivers that had once flowed energetically across the plains became shallow streams, then trickling channels, then dry paths where children could walk without getting their feet wet. The soil hardened, vegetation struggled, herds moved away, and because humans rely on the same resources as every other species, they followed. Migration became a necessity rather than a choice. People packed up their belongings, tools, baskets, simple ornaments, memories of what had once been, and set out in search of more reliable water. This wasn't an age of monumental architecture. People didn't leave behind cities where archaeologists could sift through layers of foundations. What they left behind were stories, passed from one generation to the next. Stories of places that had been full of water, Stories of rivers that used to run through valleys now swallowed by dust. Stories of hunting grounds that disappeared so gradually it felt like watching a friend fade over time. These stories survived even after the landscapes themselves did not. And as families moved farther away, spreading into new regions, the memory of those green lands became a distant echo, reshaped by each retelling. If you could watch the Sahara's drying from a high vantage point, maybe even from the center of the Richat Structure itself, the change would look like a slow retreat, lakes pulling inward decade by decade. Shorelines collapsing, riverbeds fracturing into networks of disconnected pools before vanishing entirely, grasslands thinning until the only plants left were the stubborn species adapted to drought. You would see the land lose color, then texture, then sound, until finally all that remained was the wind sweeping grains of sand across empty plains. But there were moments during this drying where the process didn't feel slow at all. When monsoon patterns shifted suddenly, regions that had relied on predictable rainfall could experience dramatic declines in just a few years. A lake that had provided generations of stability might disappear in 2 or 3 long drought cycles. Floods that once rejuvenated riverbanks might stop arriving altogether. These moments would have felt catastrophic to the people experiencing them. They wouldn't have had the language of climate science, but they would have understood that something fundamental had changed in their eyes. The land had turned against them. Such moments of environmental collapse often become the seeds of myths. A lake vanishing can become a story about the gods withdrawing a gift. A flood that never returns can become a story about a cursed people. A migration forced by drought can become a tale of exile. When these stories pass through enough generations, the context blurs and the details shift. What once described a drying valley might eventually become a narrative of a kingdom sinking beneath waves or disappearing overnight. Not because the original event was exaggerated maliciously, but because the environment changed more quickly than human memory could keep up with. As the desert expanded, dunes began to march across the land. Sand doesn't move with purpose, it simply responds to wind, drifting slowly over everything in its path. It fills valleys, it buries old lake beds, it smooths over animal tracks, human footprints, and any fragile structures that once stood nearby. Over centuries, dunes consumed the last evidence of the old Sahara. Rock art survived only where cliffs or caves shielded it. Any settlements built from organic materials vanished entirely. The landscape became clean, empty, and silent, a perfect blank slate for future generations to wonder about. Today, when you look across the Sahara, it's difficult to imagine the world that came before it. The silence is heavy. The land feels ancient in a way that suggests permanence, but permanence is an illusion. The desert is young, geologically speaking. It is still changing, still shifting, still carrying beneath its surface the faint outlines of rivers that once sustained entire populations. And in the midst of this world of sand sits the Richat Structure, a relic of deeper geological time that somehow feels connected to the stories of the people who once lived nearby. If early civilizations or pastoral groups did gather near the Richat Structure in greener times, they would have watched their world collapse gradually. The retreat of the lakes, the shrinking of rivers, the decline of herds, and the encroachment of sand would have felt like losing a home in slow motion. And when those people moved on, their stories went with them. Stories of a place where water once flowed. Stories of circular hills or landscapes shaped in ways that felt meaningful. These stories might have evolved into tales of lost worlds, not because anyone invented them out of fantasy, but because the original geographic references vanished. This is what makes the drawing of the Sahara such a powerful backdrop for ancient legends. When a land undergoes such a dramatic transformation, memories of the old world become mythic by default. A fertile plain becomes a garden of the gods. A shrinking lake becomes a vanishing kingdom. A circular plateau becomes a city swallowed by disaster. Not because any of these interpretations are literally true, but because the landscape changed so completely that the only way to explain it was through story. By the time later civilizations began writing their records, the Green Sahara had been gone for thousands of years. All that remained were scattered hints, maps with odd symbols, travelers' reports of ancient rivers, and faint memories passed through cultures far from where the original events took place. And all of it sets the stage for the comparisons and questions that would later emerge when people finally saw the Richat structure from above and began searching for meaning in its perfect rings. With the ancient landscape transformed, the stage is set for the next part of the mystery: how the Richat structure quietly echoes elements of Plato's most enduring legend. Chapter 3. Atlantis, Coincidence or Clues? By the time people began comparing the Richat structure to Atlantis, Plato had already been misunderstood, misquoted, stretched into metaphors he never intended, and, to his likely horror, placed at the center of more conspiracy theories than any other philosopher in history. Yet at the core of his tale is a surprisingly compact list of details, simple descriptions that, when read plainly, don't sound like mystical riddle poetry or coded allegory. They sound like someone describing a place, a very specific place with very specific features. Whether he meant it literally, symbolically, or somewhere between the two is a debate scholars love to have, usually over too much coffee, but the details themselves are straightforward enough to explore calmly. The centerpiece of Plato's description is the shape. Atlantis, he wrote, was arranged in concentric rings, alternating circles of land and water, each perfectly circular, each surrounding the next. This is the detail that grabs people instantly because most landscapes do not naturally arrange themselves into rings, and when you see a 25-mile-wide circular formation in northwest Africa, your brain taps you on the shoulder and whispers, "Huh, interesting." Plato describes 3 rings of water and 2 of land, though he also notes that parts of the outer sections were later modified by the Atlanteans themselves, which means even in his own story, the shape wasn't necessarily pristine or untouched. When you compare this to the Richat structure, you naturally see a resemblance, not a perfect match, not a one-to-one replication, but a visual echo, a geological rhythm that resembles a narrative rhythm. Next come the mountains. To the north of Atlantis, Plato describes a notable mountain range, high, sheltering, and rich with rivers. The Richat structure sits in front of the Adrar Plateau, a rugged highland that, in a greener era, would have looked like a natural barrier protecting the region from northern winds. Today it looks like ancient stone sculpted by ages of dryness, but 10,000 years ago those elevations would have been covered in vegetation, dotted with water sources, and significantly more imposing. The match isn't perfect, but it's enough to make you tilt your head slightly. Plato then mentions the plain to the south, long, level, fertile. In his account, this plain was one of the defining features of the Atlantean realm, not the center city, but the agricultural heartland that supported it. In the modern Sahara, fertile plains feel like a strange fantasy, but during the African humid period, they were very real. Vast stretches of land south of the Richat structure once held grasslands, wetlands, and seasonal rivers. The environment shifted dramatically with each cycle of climate change, but during the greener ages the region could have supported exactly the kind of plains Plato describes. Whether he was referencing this area or somewhere entirely different is impossible to say, but the environmental context overlaps in interesting ways. One of the most striking details Plato gives is about the materials used in Atlantis. He refers to red, black, and white stones, distinct colors quarried from the landscape and used for construction. The Richat region naturally contains these colors in abundance. Iron-rich sandstones provide reds, dark volcanic rocks and basalts provide blacks, pale limestones and quartzites provide whites. Again, this doesn't prove anything at all. It simply means the palette Plato described exists in the region, which is more of a quiet coincidence than a revelation. But it's the accumulation of quiet coincidences that tends to capture people's attention. Then there is the detail about elephants. Plato notes that the island of Atlantis had many elephants, not a few, not occasional sightings, but many today. The idea of elephants in the Sahara feels absurd, a contradiction to the very concept of a desert. But the Green Sahara held elephants in abundance. Rock art across the region depicts entire herds with casual familiarity. Fossil evidence confirms that elephants ranged widely across North Africa during humid periods. For most of human history, elephants were not exotic in this region. They were part of the everyday ecosystem, so when Plato casually mentions them, it aligns comfortably with what we know about the Sahara's long-lost environment. Plato also describes a freshwater well at the center of the city, providing clean water even as the outer rings filled with seawater. This detail feels mythic at first, but it also reflects a basic geographic truth. Many circular landforms, especially those rising from domed uplift, often have central depressions or areas where water collects. The Richat Structure's core is lower than its outer rings, and though it holds no water today, in a wetter climate it may have held springs or temporary ponds after seasonal rains. Early humans could have used such features for drinking water. As climates changed, memories of these water sources might have been folded into later stories. The river to the sea detail is where the puzzle grows delicate. Plato describes a channel from the city to the ocean, allowing ships to pass through the rings. The Richat Structure is inland today, very inland, but ancient river systems in the region once flowed toward the Atlantic. Satellite imagery captures paleo-channels that trace ancient waterways westward. The landforms no longer match these paths because the Sahara has reshaped itself repeatedly, but it is not impossible that rivers once connected this region to coastal plains that have since eroded, drowned, or shifted beneath rising sea levels. All these details create a gentle sensation. Not belief, not certainty, just curiosity. Plato's list is simple enough that it can't be mapped cleanly onto any one place. It can describe a landscape long gone, a symbolic metaphor, or a region badly distorted by oral tradition before ever reaching Greek ears. His text leaves just enough room for interpretation and just enough specificity to make pattern-seeking minds perk up when they see a satellite photo of the Richat Structure. The most important thing to remember is that Plato was not attempting to write a historical documentary. He wasn't giving coordinates or providing an atlas. His story was part philosophical argument, part political commentary, and part inherited memory. He may have drawn from older Egyptian traditions or misunderstood travel accounts or combined several cultural memories into one dramatic narrative. But within that narrative lies a pattern. Rings, plains, mountains, colors, elephants, rivers that align loosely, gently, and intriguingly with what once existed in parts of North Africa. What makes this segment of the mystery so soothing to explore is the absence of pressure. You don't need the Richat structure to be Atlantis. You don't need the description to match perfectly. All you need is the simple awareness that Plato left a list of clues describing a place that may have existed in the deep past, a place shaped by water, climate, geography, and memory. And when you place those clues beside a quiet, circular geological formation surrounded by a desert that used to be alive, it becomes easy to drift into a state of gentle wonder, the kind that invites curiosity without demanding conclusions. Once you've examined Plato's clues and quietly accepted that some of them line up with the Richat structure in a pleasantly suspicious way, the next step is to look at the smaller oddities, the details that don't prove anything on their own but linger in the mind like faint fingerprints on ancient glass. These are the features that make researchers pause, tilt their heads slightly, and say something academic like, "Well, that's interesting." They don't demand conclusions, they simply refuse to be ignored. One of the strangest among them is the presence of ancient salt deposits inside the Richat structure. In a desert environment where rain is scarce and water evaporates quickly, salt isn't surprising by itself. What is surprising is the suggestion that the salt layers within the structure formed through processes involving ancient water bodies. Some geologists have pointed out that portions of the Richat contain evaporate deposits, minerals that form when water sits, lingers, and evaporates over long stretches of time. This doesn't mean the Richat was once a lake, but it does hint that water interacted with its geology in ways that aren't immediately obvious from the modern climate. When you picture the Sahara during a humid phase, rivers flowing, lakes filling, storm clouds gathering, it becomes easy to imagine water pooling in the structure's circular basins, creating the kind of environment where salt layers could slowly accumulate. Then there are the ancient river systems that slither beneath the desert like ghosts of a wetter world. Radar imaging in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed the outlines of these massive paleochannels, dried riverbeds that once carried immense volumes of water across North Africa. Some of these channels flow in directions that match Plato's narrative surprisingly well, running from deep inland regions toward what is now the Atlantic coastline. In modern geography, the Richat structure sits far from the sea, but in the world of 10,000 or even 8,000 years ago, the landscape would have been dramatically different. Coastlines were altered, deltas shifted, and river networks created pathways across regions that are now hostile to life. When you consider these ancient waterways, the idea of a circular formation once connected to a westward flowing system becomes far less far-fetched. Another curiosity is the distribution of ancient fauna across the region, especially elephants. Plato goes out of his way to mention that Atlantis had many elephants, as though their presence was noteworthy, and it would have been if you were writing for an audience in classical Greece, where elephants were known but rarely encountered. But in the Green Sahara, elephants weren't exotic at all. Fossil evidence shows they roamed freely across vast stretches of North Africa. Rock art carved by prehistoric peoples depicts them with a kind of casual familiarity, often standing near lakes or grazing beside herds of cattle. The presence of elephants in Plato's narrative doesn't align with modern geography, but it aligns beautifully with the prehistoric Sahara, suggesting that the imagery in his account may have been drawn from memories of a much earlier landscape. Tools and artifacts found throughout Mauritania add another layer of quiet intrigue. Archaeologists have uncovered stone tools, habitation traces and remnants of early human activity around regions adjacent to the Richat Structure. None of these finds point to an advanced or monumental civilization, but they confirm that humans lived, traveled, and worked in the area long before the desert swallowed it. Simple stone tools may not inspire the same imagination as grand ruins, but they indicate human presence. People exploring the ridges, hunting across the plains, or gathering plants near seasonal water. And while these finds don't match the grandeur of Plato's Atlantis, they contribute to a broader truth. This land was not always empty. Then there's the matter of erosion patterns. The Richat Structure's rings are composed of alternating layers of hard quartzite and softer sandstone. Over millions of years, erosion carved the concentric ridges into their present shape. The science here is solid, yet the level of preservation, how clearly the rings remain visible after such immense timescales, is quietly surprising. Erosion usually softens shapes, blurs lines, and creates irregular patterns. The Richat's rings are worn but still strikingly coherent. They have a kind of stubborn symmetry, the sort that feels almost architectural even though it is entirely natural. When viewed from above, the rings appear too clean for the surrounding environment, as if the land is trying a little harder than necessary to maintain its shape. Another oddity lies in the mineral composition scattered across the formation. Geologists have noted that the area contains minerals associated with hydrothermal activity, meaning the region once experienced heat and fluid movement beneath the Earth's surface. This supports the uplift theory, but also paints a picture of a place shaped by multiple overlapping geological events. The Richat Structure is not the result of a single moment. It is the result of a series of slow, layered processes interacting in strangely harmonious ways. When geological events stack neatly like this, creating a tidy circle in the middle of a continent, it sparks the imagination, because nature rarely arranges its complexity into something that looks organized from space. Some people point to the alignment of the structure with ancient travel routes, though this is more speculative. During the Sahara's greener days, groups traveling across the region might have used prominent landforms as markers. A circular plateau would have stood out. It might have acted as a natural waypoint in a place you recognized from a distance, a feature that reassured you that your path was correct. This doesn't make it a settlement or a central city, but it makes it part of the landscape of human movement. Landmarks have always shaped migration, even unintentionally. Then there's the subtle but persistent fascination researchers have with the interior depressions of the Richat Structure. The central basin and inner rings create natural pockets where water might have pooled during rainy seasons. These areas could have provided temporary freshwater sources long before the desert took hold. If early communities ever camped here, the structure might have served as a resting place, a place where the land, by pure coincidence, gathered the elements people needed to survive. None of these oddities amount to direct evidence of Atlantis or any lost civilization. They don't point to architecture, writing, or engineering. They don't claim that the Richat Structure is anything more than a geological formation shaped by erosion, uplift, and deep time. But taken together, these small details create a sense of place, a landscape shaped by water, life, and environmental transformation. A place where memories of a greener world might have lingered long after the land grew silent. A place that feels like it carries the whispers of older stories, even if those stories can never be proven. What remains after examining these clues is not certainty, but the soft, contemplative feeling of a mystery that refuses to resolve too neatly. That's the charm of the Richat structure, not that it answers questions, but that it invites you to keep asking them slowly and without urgency, the same way the desert allows time to drift without needing conclusions. After exploring the curious parallels and intriguing coincidences, it's important to settle into the other side of the discussion, the quiet, grounded, scientifically steady side, the side that takes a deep breath, adjusts its glasses metaphorically, and says, "All right, let's not get carried away." Because while the Richat structure is visually compelling and undeniably mysterious in its aesthetic, the case against it being anything remotely like Atlantis is just as strong as the case that makes people wonder in the first place. And acknowledging that doesn't make the mystery less soothing. In fact, it makes it more balanced, more realistic, and more grounded in the rhythm of nature rather than the drama of myth. One of the simplest arguments against the Richat Atlantis connection is the absence of ruins. No foundations, no walls, no pottery fragments, no structural remnants of any kind. If a major civilization once existed here, even one without monumental stone architecture, we would expect to find some trace of it. People leave things behind: tools, shards, fire pits, bones, carvings, symbolic objects, something. The Sahara is harsh, but not harsh enough to erase every sign of human activity. If a dense population had lived here, small nomadic encampments leave faint traces, farming settlements leave soil signatures, even temporary villages create debris. But inside the Richat structure, archaeological evidence is scarce, scattered, and entirely consistent with occasional prehistoric habitation rather than a populous, organized city. Another clear issue is scale. Plato describes Atlantis as a powerful naval civilization capable of launching fleets, influencing foreign regions, and maintaining a capital city large enough to impress outsiders. This would require infrastructure, labor specialization, long-distance trade, and durable materials. The Green Sahara did support human life, but the evidence we have, stone tools, simple camps, modest cultural artifacts, points to pastoral and hunter-gatherer lifestyles rather than elaborate urban systems. There were no harbors, no shipyards, no canal networks, and certainly no signs of advanced engineering. The gap between the archaeological record and the expectations for a sprawling maritime empire is wide, calm, and fairly conclusive. Geology presents its own firm counterpoints. The Richat structure is understood through a series of geological processes involving uplift and erosion. Its rings aren't artificial. They are layers of sedimentary rock carved gently over millions of years by wind and water. The symmetry of these rings feels uncanny when viewed from orbit, but up close, the terrain reveals irregularities, breaks, inconsistencies, and natural erosion patterns that would make any idea of artificial construction almost impossible. Nature has had a very long time to perfect this formation. It didn't need architects. It needed time, pressure, shifting plates, and the slow sculpting of weather. The age of the rocks is another point of conflict. Many layers of the Richat structure date back hundreds of millions of years, far older than anything humans could have shaped. The uplift likely occurred tens of millions of years ago. Even the youngest erosional processes are far older than the timeline of human civilization. If Plato's account referred to an advanced society around 9600 BCE, the Richat's geological history simply does not align. Humans were not carving rings into uplifted domes while mammoths still roamed the northern forests. The idea collapses under the sheer weight of deep time. There is also the question of context. Atlantis, as Plato describes it, was a hub of Atlantic navigation, a power that interacted with Mediterranean societies, but the Richat structure sits far inland, even accounting for ancient coastlines. Even at its closest connection, this region would have required extensive river systems or routes across wide plains, and while ancient rivers existed, the logistics of sustaining a large maritime civilization so far from stable ocean access are difficult to justify. Plato's Atlantis was a sea power. The Richat region was, at best, a freshwater-rich inland landscape during humid periods. Another important point comes from understanding Plato himself. His dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, are philosophical works, not historical treatises. Atlantis serves as a metaphorical lesson about societal hubris, moral decay, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Ancient Greek writers often crafted allegorical narratives in grand mythic terms. They weren't necessarily recording precise histories. Even if Plato drew inspiration from older Egyptian stories or folk memories of distant lands, his purpose wasn't to document geography, it was to illustrate ideas. Seeing Atlantis as literal misses the genre he was writing in. Then there's the lack of supporting historical records. No Egyptian writings describe a circular coastal city matching Plato's description. No Phoenician traders mention it in their maritime logs. No Carthaginian accounts reference such a settlement. In a region with extensive interactions between early Mediterranean and African cultures, a highly advanced city would almost certainly have left some mark in oral or written traditions beyond Plato's single dialogue. The silence is telling. All these points form the steady, sensible, scientifically grounded case against the Richat structure being Atlantis or any ancient lost civilization. Yet none of them make the structure less fascinating. The Richat stands out precisely because it embodies contradictions, visually striking but geologically ordinary, evocative of myth yet entirely natural, surrounded by desert but shaped by water in the deep past. The structure's intrigue lies not in what humans built, but in what nature carved and time concealed. What the scientific perspective ultimately gives us is a sense of humility. The Richat structure is a reminder that Earth's landscapes can mimic human patterns accidentally, that erosion can outperform architects, that symmetry doesn't always imply intention, and that sometimes the most interesting mysteries are the ones that sit comfortably between explanation and imagination. There is a quiet comfort in acknowledging what the Richat structure is not, because it allows us to appreciate what it is. A monumental geological formation shaped entirely by natural processes, yet somehow capable of whispering to the part of the human mind that loves stories of lost worlds. Dismissing the Atlantis comparison doesn't end the mystery. It reframes it, shifting the focus from fantasy to the wonder of a landscape that survived floods, droughts, and time itself. And somewhere between geological certainty and mythic speculation lies a middle path, a gentle possibility that doesn't require lost empires or supernatural disasters. Only the simple fact that landscapes change, memories drift, and stories evolve across generations. That quiet middle ground forms the foundation for the next part of this chapter. After weighing the clues and counterpoints, what remains is a space in between, a soft, contemplative middle ground where certainty isn't required and imagination doesn't have to be excessive. It's the place where most real historical mysteries quietly live, suspended between the cold confidence of science and the gentle allure of myth. The Richat structure fits comfortably there. Not as Atlantis, not as evidence of a forgotten super-civilization, but as something far more grounded and oddly more beautiful. A landscape that carries echoes of memories older than history itself. This middle ground begins with an idea that's far less glamorous than lost empires but far more plausible, that Plato's account of Atlantis may have been shaped by older stories, older observations, and older memories passed through generations of storytellers, traders, and priests, not memories of a technologically advanced society, but memories of places that once existed and then disappeared as the world changed. Civilizations don't have to be grand to be worth remembering. A pastoral group displaced by drought can leave behind a story that grows in the telling. A lakeside settlement swallowed by desert winds can become a tale of a city lost. A dramatic shift in climate can be recast as a divine punishment, and long after the physical evidence is gone, the story continues, reshaped a little each time it's spoken aloud. If you imagine early North African cultures watching their world change, watching lakes shrink, herds migrate, familiar routes vanish beneath encroaching sand, it's easy to understand how memories of those landscapes could eventually transform into myths about lost worlds. The Sahara didn't disappear overnight, but it disappeared quickly enough in human terms that it would have felt, to those who lived through it, like watching a homeland dissolve. People don't forget something like that. They carry it into new regions, tell it to their children, bury it in rituals and cautionary tales, and as those stories move from one culture to another, details shift, embellishments form, and simple memories become larger narratives. When Plato eventually recorded the Atlantis story, he may have been receiving not a literal historical account, but a story already many generations old. A story so old, in fact, that the geography behind it had changed completely since the original events. That is the gentle possibility that keeps the Richat conversation alive. Not that it was Atlantis, but that it resembles the type of place that could have inspired memories strong enough to survive climate shifts, migrations, and cultural reinterpretation. In this middle ground, the Richat structure becomes less a candidate for Atlantis and more a symbol for the forgotten worlds that once existed during the Sahara's green phases. The circular shape isn't a blueprint, it's a coincidence that resembles human descriptions of circular settlements or lake systems. The environment around it, once fertile, later desolate, fits the rhythm of myths describing lands that flourished and then vanished, and the geological strangeness of the formation makes it the type of place human imagination gravitates toward, even without evidence of ancient cities or monumental architecture. This perspective is calm and grounding. It acknowledges that the Richat structure is geological, not architectural. It embraces the idea that natural formations can inspire awe without requiring supernatural explanations, and it allows space for the possibility that human stories, especially the very old ones, often preserve impressions of landscapes altered or erased by time. In this view, Atlantis isn't a lost city waiting to be excavated. It's a cultural memory of a world transformed. The middle ground also makes room for one of the most fascinating aspects of human storytelling, our tendency to merge different memories into single narratives. Imagine an Egyptian priest hearing tales from travelers who claim their ancestors once lived in a land where water flowed through concentric valleys. Imagine those memories mixing with other stories of disappearing lakes, ancient floods, or regions swallowed by drought. Imagine Plato hearing a version of that tale centuries later, filtered through generations of reinterpretation. By the time he wrote it down, the story would have been a blend, part geography, part metaphor, part nostalgia for a world the teller never saw. This blending of truth and tale is not deception, it's how oral traditions work. Details shift, landscapes become symbols, Natural disasters become moral lessons. A story meant to explain why the world changed becomes a story explaining why people must be humble. Even today, we do this without realizing it. We condense complex events into simple narratives because simple narratives are easier to remember, easier to teach, and easier to carry into the future. In the calm light of this middle ground, the Richat Structure serves as a gentle reminder that landscapes shape stories just as stories shape our perception of landscapes. The structure's rings might have meant nothing to the people who walked across it thousands of years ago, but to someone hearing a distorted account of those landscapes generations later, the image of a circular landform might have blossomed into something mythic. Not because the Richat Structure was Atlantis, but because it felt like the kind of place myths grow from, strange, memorable, and entirely out of step with its surroundings. The temptation of this middle path lies in its openness. You don't have to believe the Richat Structure hides ruins. You don't have to assume ancient people built concentric canals. You don't even have to decide whether Atlantis existed as a literal place. You simply accept that the ancient world was filled with environments now gone, and that stories from those environments survived in forms we barely recognize. The Richat Structure becomes one of many possible inspirations, not the answer, but an echo. There's something soothing about mysteries that don't demand solutions. They allow your mind to drift without needing to arrive anywhere specific. The Richat Structure isn't a riddle asking to be solved. It's an invitation to explore deeper layers of time, to imagine landscapes that no longer exist, and to appreciate how human memory stretches across millennia. It reminds us that myths often begin with something real, not a lost empire necessarily, but a lost environment, a lost way of life, or a lost understanding of the land. And that leads us gently into the final chapter of this journey, a shift away from evidence and counter-evidence, and toward the quiet, cosmic perspective that emerges when you consider how long the Richat Structure has watched the desert around it rise, fall, and change. Chapter 4. The Eye That Remembers Everything. If you ever find yourself imagining the Richat Structure at night, it helps to forget the satellite photos and geological diagrams for a moment and picture something much quieter, a place far from modern roads, far from city lights, far from anything that interrupts the soft rhythm of the desert after sunset. Night in the Sahara is its own world, almost a separate dimension from the harsh daylight that most people think defines it. The heat drains away slowly, the wind settles into a steady breath across the dunes, and the sky opens wider than seems reasonable, filled with stars that feel impossibly close. In that stillness, the Richat Structure doesn't feel like a geological puzzle or a misunderstood legend. It feels ancient in a way few places do, as if it has been sitting patiently through eras, watching everything change around it while remaining almost unchanged itself. Standing at the center of the formation under a clear sky would feel like standing inside a natural observatory. The circular ridges rise around you, not high enough to trap you, but just high enough to create the sense of being in a vast stone bowl. The curves would guide your gaze upward toward the sky, making the stars appear as though they are swirling in unison with the rings below. There are no lights to dim the stars, no distant hum of traffic, no artificial sounds, just the low whisper of the wind brushing across ancient rock, passing through channels carved by time, creating tones so soft you might not even register them consciously. In that kind of quiet, the desert feels alive, not in a dramatic or mystical way, but in the subtle way landscapes breathe through temperature shifts, airflow, and tens of thousands of years of stillness. The moonlight transforms the Richat structure even further. The pale light pools in the lower depressions and glides across the ridges, revealing the circular symmetry that can be hard to see when you're standing on the ground during the day. At night, those rings shine faintly, almost glowing in places where quartzite catches the moon's reflection. The effect is soothing, not eerie, the kind of sight that makes you exhale slowly, not look over your shoulder. The desert has always been a place where time feels soft and stretched, and inside the Richat at night, that feeling only deepens, as if the land is gently reminding you that it has existed far longer than any human story about it. There is something comforting about how little the Richat structure demands. It doesn't insist on meaning. It doesn't ask to be interpreted. It simply sits, weathered and patient, while the sky above it cycles through constellations that ancient people once used to navigate across greener lands. Thousands of years ago, when the Sahara was still alive with lakes and grasslands, early humans would have looked up at the same stars, using them to track seasons, migrations, and time. They may have passed near the Richat without knowing its shape, but they would have walked under this same sky, feeling the same cool air after sunset, listening to similar breezes skimming across the land. In that sense, the desert night turns the Richat structure into a bridge between eras, not because anything connects them physically, but because the sky has remained one of the few constants across the entire sweep of human history. If you were to sit on one of the ridges and look out into the darkness, you would see nothing but the silhouettes of dunes shifting gently in the moonlight. The horizon softens at night, blending sky and sand into a single muted line. It's the kind of scene that encourages introspection, not analysis. You don't wonder who built the structure or whether it held palaces or temples. You simply feel the weight of time, not as something heavy or intimidating, but as something vast and calming. The world has changed so many times, and the Richat has been here through all of it, absorbing the silence, weathering the storms, and watching the land around it transform. The desert's silence isn't empty. It holds layers of memory, not the kind you can excavate with tools, but the kind that lingers in atmosphere. The silence feels old, as if it carries a faint awareness of the worlds that once existed here. Lakes reflecting starlight, animals moving across grasslands, families gathering near fires that burned in a landscape now gone. The nighttime air feels thick with that invisible history, yet it doesn't demand your attention. It simply exists, like a soft background hum. The stars above the Richat structure appear especially dense because of the region's extreme remoteness. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a pale river of light, echoing the rivers that once flowed across the Sahara during its humid phases. The longer you look, the more constellations seem to reveal themselves, and the more the structure on the ground feels connected to the cosmos above. The rings of the Richat mirror the vast circular patterns in the sky, the arcs of the galaxy, the curvature of the horizon, the slow rotation of the Earth itself. It creates a sense of gentle symmetry between Earth and sky, a reminder that humans have always found meaning in patterns even when those patterns were accidental. It's easy to understand why people feel drawn to connect this ancient formation with legends. Standing inside the Richat at night could make anyone feel the urge to tell a story, not a sensational one, but a quiet one about the persistence of the land, the fragility of memory, and the way nature sometimes creates shapes that feel like symbols. In the soft glow of the moon, the structure doesn't look artificial, but it does look intentional in a way only nature at its most patient can achieve. What makes the Richat structure so soothing at night is the way it absorbs human curiosity without answering it. You can wonder about its origins, its place in mythology, its connection to past climates, or whether ancient people ever felt a hint of awe when passing near it. But the structure offers nothing back except the gentle assurance that it will still be here long after our questions fade into silence. In that sense, it becomes a reminder not of lost civilizations, but of time's quiet endurance, the slow, steady processes that shape the earth far beyond human timelines. And as the night grows deeper and the air cools further, the Richat structure settles into complete stillness, becoming not a mystery to solve, but a place to simply exist for a moment, to rest, to breathe, and to absorb the sense of calm that comes from standing in a landscape that has survived every climate, every story, and every shift the world has thrown at it. The next layer of this journey explores the source of that storytelling instinct, why humans see patterns, build myths, and create meaning from landscapes that endure long after the civilizations around them disappear. If you sit long enough inside the Richat structure, not literally of course, but in your mind, quietly imagining the desert night and the slow movement of stars overhead, you eventually drift into a very human question. Why do we tell stories about places like this? Why do certain landscapes, certain formations, certain patterns pull at the imagination more strongly than others? We don't look at an ordinary hill and assume it holds ancient secrets. We don't stare at a random cluster of rocks and start crafting mythologies, yet give us a perfect circle in the middle of a desert, or a mountain shaped like a face, or a forest that feels too symmetrical to be an accident, and our brains immediately begin weaving meaning into the shapes. It isn't irrational, it's instinctive, a deep part of how humans make sense of the world, especially the parts of it that feel older than our ability to explain them. That instinct begins with something simple: pattern recognition. Humans are exceptional at spotting patterns even when those patterns don't exist. It's a survival trait. Recognizing the difference between a harmless shadow and a predator hiding in the bushes was once a matter of life and death. Over time, that instinct expanded into art, religion, storytelling, and all the imaginative ways we try to connect the dots between what we see and what we feel. When early people saw the rings of the Richat structure, perhaps not from the ground but from the gradual rise of surrounding terrain, they might have sensed an unusual regularity in its shape. Maybe not enough to interpret it as a city or a monument, but enough to remember it, enough to describe it, enough to make it feel distinct from the ordinary landscapes around it. The human imagination thrives on places that feel just slightly out of place. The Richat structure does exactly that. It's too round, too wide, too neatly layered to blend in with the rugged desert. It doesn't look artificial, but it doesn't look random either. It occupies a liminal space, natural but strangely intentional in appearance, and when a landscape hovers in that space, the imagination naturally steps in to fill the gaps. People project stories onto it not to deceive anyone, but because stories help us understand what feels beyond understanding. Storytelling is how humans anchor themselves in time, how they transform landscapes into memories, and how they preserve experiences that might otherwise vanish. This is why even the calmest, most scientific minds sometimes drift into gentle speculation when they look at places like the Richat, not because they truly believe in lost empires hiding under millions of years of erosion, but because landscapes with unusual beauty evoke a sense of quiet wonder, and wonder is a fertile ground for stories. You don't need to imagine Atlantis rising and falling. You only need to imagine how it felt for early communities to live in a Sahara full of lakes and wildlife, passing by a strange circular plateau that looked different each season. Maybe it was a landmark, maybe it was a gathering point, maybe it meant nothing at all, but it would have stood out, and anything that stands out tends to gather stories. Humans also tell stories because the natural world isn't always generous with explanations. For most of history, people didn't have geology textbooks or climate models. They had observations, intuition, and oral traditions. When a river dried, they created a story. When a mountain erupted, they created a story. When the stars shifted seasonally, they created stories to explain their patterns. Over generations, these stories evolved, blending details from nature with the emotional tone of the people describing them. A drought wasn't just an environmental event, it became a moral narrative of balance lost and regained. A vanished lake wasn't just climate change, it became a tale of a great flood or a divine warning or a forgotten world swallowed by forces beyond human control. It isn't surprising that the Richat Structure, surrounded by a desert shaped by one of the most dramatic climate transformations in human prehistory, inspires curiosity bordering on myth. Long before Plato wrote about Atlantis, people across the Sahara would have witnessed environmental shifts so profound they could barely describe them. Shrinking lakes, migrating animals, the slow invasion of sand, these experiences leave emotional impressions. A landscape that once supported entire populations can fade into silence within a few generations, and when that happens, the stories that form afterward are rarely literal accounts. They become metaphors for loss, change, and the fragility of human presence. The act of storytelling also brings comfort. It creates order in places where nature seems chaotic. It offers meaning in events that feel senseless, and it allows cultures to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. A story about a lost world isn't just entertainment. It's a way of saying, something important happened here, don't forget it. Those stories can stretch across thousands of years, even if the exact details blur. The memory of a disappearing lake might evolve into a legend of an entire region swallowed by the sea. The recollection of an unusually shaped landform might become a story about circular cities or divine architecture. When landscapes change as drastically as the Sahara did, the human imagination steps in to preserve what the land no longer shows. What's interesting is that the imagination doesn't only reach backward, it also reaches upward. Humans have always linked earthly landscapes with the sky. The circular shape of the Richat Structure mirrors patterns in the heavens, orbits, celestial spheres, the arc of the Milky Way. Ancient cultures often looked at the sky and the earth as mirrors of one another. If something looked meaningful on the ground, they assumed a celestial connection. If something appeared in the stars, they looked for its reflection in the landscape. This tendency isn't mystical, it's psychological. It creates symmetry between the known and the unknown, allowing people to navigate a confusing world through harmony rather than randomness. The Richat Structure invites that kind of thinking. At night, when the stars swirl overhead and the rings below form a gentle spiral of shadow and light, it becomes easy to understand how the human imagination might link the two, not through elaborate theories, but through quiet intuition, through the simple feeling that a place shaped in circles must hold a story shaped in circles, through the awareness that landscapes sometimes look like symbols even when they are not, through the natural desire to connect the visible world with the invisible past. In the end, the human imagination isn't a flaw in our understanding of places like the Richat Structure. It's a companion, It allows us to explore possibilities without insisting on answers. It lets us appreciate mysteries without demanding they be solved. And it reminds us that even when we know the scientific explanation for a geological formation, we can still feel wonder, still be moved by the beauty of its shape, and still tell stories about what it might have meant to the people who walked through a greener Sahara thousands of years ago. That instinct to remember, to reinterpret, to imagine, leads naturally into the next part of this journey. The way deserts protect, preserve, and occasionally conceal pieces of worlds that no longer exist, leaving behind not cities but quiet geological breadcrumbs for the patient observer. When people think of the desert, they often imagine it as a place that erases everything. Wind sweeping across dunes, sand swallowing anything left on the surface, time grinding all traces of the past into dust. And while parts of that are true, the desert is far more complicated. It destroys, yes, but it also preserves in ways wetter climates never can. Humidity decays wood, softens clay, and corrodes metal. Rain washes away structures and scatters artifacts. Plants reclaim abandoned land quickly, burying the past in roots and soil. But the desert is patient. Dry air keeps things intact. Sand buries but also protects. Stone carvings last almost forever when nothing grows to break them apart. If anything, the Sahara is one of the most powerful memory keepers on Earth, even if it rarely gives up those memories easily. The Richat Structure sits in the middle of this vast archive, not an archive of books or ruins or treasure, but an archive of landscapes. The rings themselves are a geological timeline. Each layer tells a story about a different era of Earth's crust. The minerals inside them remember volcanic activity, erosion patterns, shifts in ancient climates, and surrounding the structure, scattered across the Sahara, lie faint traces of worlds that came and went before the desert took over. Fossils of fish that once swam in freshwater lakes, shells from ancient inland seas, bones of hippos, giraffes, elephants, and antelope that lived in grasslands where nothing but dunes now remain. These remnants are quiet, fragile, and astonishingly well preserved because the desert has held them still for millennia. Even more delicate objects survive in surprising numbers. Stone tools left behind by early humans who walked across plains now buried under dunes, arrowheads, blades, grinding stones, small carvings. They're scattered, not concentrated, evidence of lives lived lightly on the land, following herds, collecting plants, moving when the seasons demanded it. None of these objects tell a story of a centralized city or a monumental culture, but they do tell the story of human persistence in a world that was constantly shifting around them. These tools have edges still sharp enough to cut. They were shaped by hands that lived in a climate we can barely imagine today. And the desert, indifferent to time, simply kept them. Then there are the rivers, or rather, the ghosts of rivers. Radar imaging reveals dozens of ancient channels beneath the Sahara's surface, some stretching hundreds of miles. These channels are not small trickles, but massive pathways carved by powerful flows of water. They show where life once concentrated, where animals gathered, where early humans traveled and settled, and though they're invisible from the ground, their presence beneath the sand acts like a geological memory, a map of how different the world used to be. Long after lakes vanished and grasslands withered, the shapes of these channels remained, buried but intact. The desert also preserves what might be called emotional landscapes, the subtle atmospheric memory of places people once inhabited. Rock art in the Sahara captures these moments with eerie clarity, carvings of cattle, religious symbols, hunting scenes, boats gliding across water. Some images show animals that haven't lived in the region for thousands of years. Others depict rituals or daily activities of groups whose descendants migrated far away when the climate changed. These paintings survive because the desert air is too dry to dissolve the pigments. They are echoes etched into stone, fragments of human emotion fossilized in mineral form. And even though they don't correspond to Plato's Atlantis, they show how easily early cultures could leave behind traces that would confuse or inspire later generations. But the desert's preservation comes with a twist. It protects selectively. It keeps what nature builds, but rarely what humans build. Wood, cloth, bone, and plant materials decay quickly, stone lasts, but only if left untouched by wind. Anything built from mud or organic material disappears, so a region could support generations of habitation and leave barely any physical evidence. When the Sahara dried, entire ways of life evaporated with it. People moved south or toward the coast, leaving only a thin scattering of tools and art behind. By the time later civilizations emerged in Egypt, Carthage, and the Mediterranean world, the memory of those Saharan cultures had already faded into rumor. What remained was the land itself, a massive desert holding fragments of forgotten worlds. The Richat structure in this context isn't a monument to something lost. It's a survivor from geological history that just happens to sit among the buried traces of human history. Its rings are not ruins, but reminders that the planet keeps records in stone long after humans forget. Its symmetry draws the imagination not because it hides a city, but because it stands out against the silence of the desert, a quiet landmark in a landscape that erases almost everything else. What the desert preserves best, strangely enough, is not artifacts or fossils, but absence. It preserves the feeling of worlds that used to exist but no longer do. It holds the echo of water where there is none. It holds the memory of animals that once roamed freely. It holds the imprint of climate cycles so vast they dwarf every human empire combined. When you stand in a place like the Richat Structure, the most powerful sensation isn't that something is buried beneath your feet. It's that something is missing, something that used to be here but isn't anymore. That sense of absence can be misunderstood as evidence of ruins or lost cities, but it's really just the desert doing what deserts do, revealing nothing and everything at the same time. And that is why this landscape inspires stories. Humans fill silence with meaning. We see the absence and imagine what might have once filled it. We see preserved fossils and picture thriving ecosystems. We see ancient riverbeds and imagine the people who walked beside them. The desert keeps just enough evidence to suggest what once existed, but not enough to tell the full story. And in that gap, wide, quiet, and centuries deep, the imagination takes over. This brings us to the final movement of this journey, a gentle widening of perspective, a step back from geology and fossils and myths, and into the broader cosmic calm that emerges when you stand in the middle of a desert night and realize just how ancient, patient, and enduring the earth truly is. When you step back from all the theories, the geology, the ancient climates, and the quiet wonders preserved by the desert, the Richat structure becomes something simpler, not a riddle demanding an answer, but a reminder of how small we are against the scale of time. Standing in the middle of its rings, especially under the night sky, you can feel the weight of millions of years pressing gently around you. Not in a frightening way, but in a calming, grounding way, the kind that makes your breath slow down without you meaning to, as if the land itself is inviting you to let go of the need for certainty. Because the truth is, the Richat structure doesn't care what we believe about it. It existed long before humans tried to make sense of it, and it will exist long after our stories fade. The desert has watched entire civilizations rise and fall at its edges, while the eye of Africa simply remained what it always was, a geological formation shaped by pressures, erosion, and deep time. And yet, for something so indifferent, it has a remarkable ability to hold our attention, to stir our imagination, to make us lean forward and whisper, "What if?" That what if doesn't need to be answered. It's enough that the question exists. It's enough that something in a quiet corner of the Sahara can evoke wonder in people who will never stand beside it. We don't need Atlantis for the Richat to matter. We don't need a lost empire or buried ruins. The formation is compelling precisely because it sits on the edge of the known and the unknown, part science, part mystery, part myth, part memory. It invites you to be curious without demanding conclusions, and that is its most soothing quality. If you imagine the Richat at its quietest moment, perhaps just before dawn, when the stars begin to fade but the sun hasn't yet lifted over the dunes, the entire landscape feels suspended. The air is cool, still carrying the desert's nighttime clarity. The sky brightens slowly, revealing the faint outlines of the rings around you. The first light washes over the ridges, turning the stone soft shades of blue and gold. In this moment, it feels as though the structure is waking up, though of course it never sleeps. It simply cycles through light and darkness, warmth and cold, day after day, century after century, long after humanity stopped paying attention, and that quiet persistence is part of its allure. The Richat structure doesn't ask for interpretation because it doesn't need us. It exists comfortably beyond our stories. We are the ones who project meaning onto it, who draw parallels, who search for patterns, and there's nothing wrong with that. Humans make meaning because it helps us navigate a world that rarely explains itself. But when you're standing in front of something so ancient, so vast, and so unaffected by our questions, the impulse to interpret eventually softens. You start to accept the landscape the way you accept the night sky, beautiful, mysterious, complete without needing answers. This is why the final feeling the Richat structure gives isn't excitement or fear or even curiosity. It's perspective, the kind of perspective that makes you realize how temporary human history is compared to geological time. Civilizations rise, cities flourish, myths form, and then everything fades. But the land remains. The Sahara has been green, then brown, then green again, then sand, then grass, then dunes. The world shifts constantly, but overspans so long that it's easy to forget. Human history is only a blink in the Earth's memory. When you imagine the Eye of Africa remembering, it's not literal, of course. Rock doesn't hold memories the way we do, but landscapes preserve patterns, scars, layers, and echoes of what came before. The Richat structure remembers not through intention, but through endurance, through the way its rings hold the imprint of ancient forces, through the way it witnessed the Sahara's transformation without changing its own essential shape, through the way it stands in the middle of emptiness, still holding the quiet dignity of something older than our oldest stories. And as you let that perspective sink in, the idea of Atlantis becomes less about a place and more about a feeling that somewhere, sometime, a world existed that is now gone, a feeling that memory outlasts evidence, a feeling that not everything that disappears is lost forever. Some things simply fade into new forms, new landscapes, new interpretations. The Richat structure doesn't solve the Atlantis mystery, but it offers a gentle space where that mystery can rest, unpressured and unbothered. In the end, the most peaceful thought of all is this: maybe Atlantis was real, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a memory of a greener Sahara. Maybe it was an echo of rivers and lakes that vanished before history began. Or maybe it was just a story, a beautifully structured story passed down through generations. But somewhere out there in the quiet heart of the desert, the Eye of Africa is still watching. Not searching, not revealing, just watching. Watching the night sky turn. Watching the dunes shift. Watching time pass with the patience only the earth itself can hold. And there is something profoundly comforting about that. To know that long after questions fade and theories shift and stories evolve, the land remains silent, enduring, timeless. A slow, cosmic heartbeat in the middle of the Sahara, inviting you to breathe a little slower, to let your thoughts drift, and to fall gently into rest. If you've made it this far, awake, half asleep, or somewhere in that gentle in-between space where thoughts drift like sand across a desert floor, then you've journeyed through one of Earth's quietest mysteries. And maybe that's the real beauty of the Richat Structure. Not that it holds answers, but that it encourages the kind of patient wondering that modern life rarely gives us time for. In a world full of noise, urgency, and constant stimulation, the Eye of Africa offers the opposite: silence, space, perspective. A slow reminder that the planet moves at a pace far older and far calmer than anything we build on its surface. When you think back to what we've explored, the green Sahara that once flourished with lakes and herds, the ancient river systems buried beneath dunes, the rock art carved by hands that lived in a world we can barely imagine, the geological forces that sculpted the Richat's rings millions of years before humans ever walked near them, it becomes clear that the story of this place isn't about a lost civilization. It's about a lost landscape, a world that once existed, quietly thrived, and then vanished not because of catastrophe, but because Earth itself shifted into a new rhythm. The Richat Structure is a witness to all of it, a memory in stone shaped not by human intention but by natural processes that unfold over spans of time far beyond our comprehension. And even though the Atlantis comparison has become part of its identity, the truth is you don't need a legend to appreciate this formation. You don't need Plato or myths of rings and cities or theories about ancient mariners. You only need the simple awareness that our planet contains places so strange and so beautiful that they feel like stories even before we start telling them. The Richat Structure is one of those places. Perfectly circular, timeless, a little unsettling, completely mesmerizing, the kind of formation that makes you pause and remember that the Earth was sculpting wonders long before anyone arrived to give them names. There's a quiet comfort in imagining the Eye of Africa as a presence rather than a puzzle, not a watcher in any mystical sense, but a symbol of endurance. It has seen the Sahara as a cradle of life, then as a wilderness, and now as a vast ocean of sand. It has seen climates shift, species migrate, and entire ecosystems vanish into memory. And through all of it, it stayed where it was, letting time carve every ridge, every basin, every curve. There's something almost meditative about that, the idea that some things don't chase meaning, they simply endure and allow us to come to them with whatever questions or stories we carry. As you settle into the final moments of this journey, imagine once more the Richat Structure under the stars, the rings around you fading into shadow, the sky stretching overhead like an ancient tapestry, the air cool, the sand carrying the day's warmth, the wind quiet enough to feel like the earth is holding its breath. In that moment, all the theories, all the debates, all the speculation falls away. What remains is just the land, unconcerned, immense, older than memory, a reminder that our place in the world is temporary but also meaningful in its own small way. And maybe that's the real gift of places like this. They allow us to step outside ourselves, to drift gently into perspective, to remember that not everything needs to be solved. Some mysteries are meant to rest, some landscapes are meant to simply be admired, and some stories, like the Sahara itself, are more soothing when left open, when allowed to breathe, when allowed to drift into the same soft silence that defines the desert at night. So as you drift towards sleep or into a deeper state of calm, let the Richat structure fade into that quiet space behind your thoughts. Let the rings dissolve into darkness, the stars soften overhead, and the desert wind carry away whatever tension you brought with you. The earth has been here a long time, and it will be here long after the worries of today have faded. You are small compared to the scale of geological time, but that smallness is not a burden. It's a comfort, a reminder that it's okay to rest. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of the planet's most beautiful and enigmatic features. If you enjoyed this journey, and you'd like to drift through more forgotten landscapes and ancient mysteries crafted to help you unwind, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps, and it means a lot. And before you fall asleep fully, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the entire world gathered in one quiet, shared moment. For now, take one last breath. Let it go slowly, and let the desert night close around you. The eye of Africa will keep its silent watch. You only need to rest